my concern around things being framed as like an inclusion based to sort of reduce exclusions or anything directed to reducing exclusions is that if success or merit either implicitly or explicitly is given to schools because of how they drastically reduce exclusions through this means or any other, that we can quickly drift away from what our sort of our main goal here, which is
reducing exclusion should never be a metric, because sometimes it's a very necessary and safe option in schools.
I would often go into head teacher or SLT and then vent about whatever issue there'd been that day, but if they're at the top, who do they have to vent to?
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, Elliot Morgan and I are back with the best good news stories from the world of education. Elliot, it's great to see you. How are you?
Very well. How are you doing?
Yeah, can't complain. Really excited to be back at the What's the Good News, especially after last time. Lots of positive reviews. People thought like the format, so we'll get stuck back in. One downside is that Apple sort of quiet blocked the episode because I reckon the copyright infringement on the little jingles I'd made. So I had to go back and take the jingles out, and now the jingles don't exist. I mean, maybe I'll make my own, like like the cost cutter music version of the songs, but I just don't have the time. Maybe in half term. So plan is to go through the good news blogs that we've been reading this month, anything that's happened since the last time. And I suppose the best place then to start is with the good news. What have been the top stories this month, Elliot?
There's one principally for me that's good news that sticks out, which is around the phone ban. I'm sure you've seen, well, not phone ban, I should say, social media ban, isn't it? But the sort of extension of that being that many secondary schools are leaning towards banning phones entirely. And I know for any sort of primary colleagues listening, I mean, in my experience, phones were never an issue in school because children would just hand them in, they get them at the end of the day. But social media did cause issues. Like I remember being in year 6 and year after year having to deal with Snapchat or WhatsApp groups being set up where like essentially one child is being ostracized by others. And I've seen anecdotally online a lot of teachers saying who have in their schools implemented a school-wide phone ban that they're seeing like drastic reduction in safeguarding issues and in arguments in school. And I think like that's the important thing to consider with the phone ban or social media ban. It's going beyond sort of this distraction in school. We're talking here about like external bullying, about mental health, about children actually socializing with people in school rather than being glued to their phones. And I know that there's inevitably going to be issues with implementing something like this. Australia has sort of led the way in a sense on that social media ban, and that it led to like teenagers just downloading alternative social media apps that hadn't been banned, and because they were like number one in the app store, and then circumventing it with VPNs. But when you're casting a wide net, inevitably you're going to prevent usage for a lot, which is a positive, a net positive in my mind. But I guess like the prohibition of it, we know from prohibition in history, doesn't stop demand, doesn't stop use, and that these platforms have been designed to maintain the attention, to maximize the engagement of these children. So there's a very deep-seated issue at play here. Like, what will the unintended consequences be of trying to ban something like that whole scale? I guess that's sort of yet to be seen. But anecdotally, as I said, many schools, leaders, teachers who have implemented these bans have said that it's had a sort of very drastically positive impact on their school community. Had you seen anything about the phone ban?
Well, actually, I mean, something that ties to those consequences or supposed consequences, because teachers are wasting hundreds of hours new research shows trying to enforce phone bans in schools. And when you look at the actual paper, they got rid of all the caveats that the researchers had in place, and they've looked at one element. And really, the research says you can't really tell the positive or negative, and our confidence interval is so wide. In terms of the consequences, there's already a narrative around, oh, we couldn't possibly do this. I think phone ban, social media ban as a parent, that fantastic, because it makes my life easier and having and being able to say no, because you don't want to say no and have your kid be the only kid who's not doing something, because then that brings its own sort of bullying worries. But as a teacher, and in primary we don't really see it much, but every year six class I've ever had an interaction with has had some sort of WhatsApp or Snapchat issue, that has had to be dealt with, So I think, it is a positive story. I think Australia leading the way. I mean, they're leading the way with the smoking ban as well for under 18s and things like that there, So I think, we'll see how it goes, but it definitely is a very, very positive story.
But yeah, I actually saw a video today. I'm gonna mix up his name. I think he was like a former teacher and now is like a researcher or cognitive scientist or psychologist of sorts. And his name is, I think it's Jared Cooney Horvath, who I think may have written some books. I'm sure you and I have both read some of his because the name rings a bell for me. But there's a video I saw online today on like C-SPAN, which is like the American equivalent of like our parliamentary committee TV. You know, when you see like experts being interviewed by MPs and so on. And he was talking about the sort of correlative relationship between screen use and the impact on like well-being and results. And he was saying like Gen Z are the first generation that haven't outperformed their parents' generation when it comes to education. It's like the first time ever. And it was like biologically we haven't changed. Schooling hasn't really changed. But the one thing that has changed is the real widespread proliferate use of screens. And in that video, he's arguing saying like at the moment this is just all correlation. We don't have causation as such, and we need to do more research into this to actively to be able to actually say we know for a fact it is screens. So yeah, I'd be very cautious in anything that tries to say one way or the other currently. If a researcher like that is telling us we don't currently have the evidence to say one way or the other, and that's someone who's going to be very very clued up on it.
Were millennials the parental generation there? Were they? Or was it just like you can't beat millennials? Is that what you're
Yeah,
getting at?
I'm not sure. He like the only actual generation he explicitly referenced in. I mean, it was only a short clip, a few minutes. The only actual generation he referenced was Gen Z, and I think he said like 2010 onwards is the real dip. But I'd be interested to see anything else that he puts out on it that sort of goes into greater depth into the issue.
Nice. I had a story not from a newspaper running out there, but from the government's website about inclusion basis. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's a reasonably big policy move. I think it's an estate strategy, and it's almost like tying in send and inclusion with the investment needs to go into school buildings. And so I think the long and short of it is that secondary schools will have an inclusion sort of area. The risk is that it becomes like a behavior unit or de facto behavior unit, but the idea is that we've got expertise on site in every secondary school. Obviously not not necessarily directly linked to primary, but if we've got feeder schools, there's no reason why we can't benefit from the inclusion thinking or the support from that expertise. So I thought that was really interesting because there's been a lot of talk about how money's actually going to be spent, which we've been waiting on for a while, and this feels like they're having to do a lot of building work. So why not develop this too?
I'm not sure if it's the exact same post, but I did see something today around, I guess similarly to this, that the government's talking about. I think it was around like 700 million um, being put into school buildings to fix. Do you remember there was like the big story a while ago about RAAC or RAC, which was like I forget what it stood for, some type of concrete that wasn't safe or there's a potential issue with it. So yeah, I assume the funding is going to a lot of issues like that, as well as these inclusion bases. And it talked about reaching around 700,000 pupils. And I think it may have even included sort of like higher education buildings as well. I mean, I welcome any funding to improve school sites. I don't know about you, but in my own secondary schooling, we had what we called the huts, which looked like sort of temporary World War II shelters that were never knocked down, and they were somehow simultaneously freezing in winter, but also boiling in summer. So I refer to them as like Schrodinger's classroom. Um, but yeah, my concern around the inclusion basis, I think it would be absolutely great to have, as you said, like if you're a primary school, being able to lean on the expertise of like behaviour units or staff that lead those in a secondary school would be invaluable. My concern around things being framed as like an inclusion base to sort of reduce exclusions or anything directed to reducing exclusions is that if success or merit, either implicitly or explicitly, is given to schools because of how they drastically reduce exclusions through this means or any other, that we can quickly drift away from what our sort of our main goal here, which is inclusion. Because if we think about like Goodhart's law, that when a target becomes a measure, it ceases to be a good measure, and that means that we may see some gaming of the system or see how data the data on it, exclusions, can we rely on it? Is it as accurate or valid as we want it to be if there are certain things being, in school exclusions rather than external exclusions, that sort of thing. So I'd be interested to see what the sort of impact of that is. But on the surface, I think it's a very positive step in inclusion reform, and obviously inclusion being the buzzword of the moment. But yeah, I guess as you sort of hinted at, that vulnerability is in the implementation of it. What does it actually look like?
Reducing exclusion should never be a metric because sometimes it's a very necessary and safe option in schools. So 100% agree with that. Did you have one more?
This isn't a positive news story. Um, it's just one that stood out to me, and I didn't see any sort of reporting on it. Um, I forget the exact title of the article, but it was on Schools Week, and it was to do with the early language support for every child program, which is known as the LSEC for short. And this article is talking about this evaluation of the program. It was a pilot, this joint pilot between the NHS and the government, and is essentially designed to screen and then support speech and language issues and communication issues in pupils in sort of the early years, that sort of age band. And the headline finding I found was deeply worrying. So, 6,300 children screened, and it found that 6 in 10 had some level of speech and language need, and that in some areas of the country, that two-thirds of children flagged for support had not been identified before. Um, the positive of this pilot is that it has reached a lot of children, and it said that it trained a lot of staff. I think it was nearly 4,000 staff had been trained, but the concerns were around the sustainability of it, including funding. So it was due to end, but then got funding for an additional 12 months. Um, so I guess the underline of this is that we can see that early intervention is effective and absolutely critical, but the sheer scale of what they uncovered is I mean, astronomical. It's clearly greater than we anticipated, or that we can necessarily account and support for in schools. So for me, that was a bit of a story that is deeply worrying and has sort of perhaps gone under the radar slightly.
Yeah, my understanding is that those numbers will be higher in areas of disadvantage, which means you've almost got this compounding effect. So if we're really serious about oracy, on a governmental level, you know, that early intervention, you could do all you want in school, but if it doesn't happen early on, then you're fighting uphill battle the rest of the way. And schools do a fantastic job of supporting pupils and supporting children, but if we can do something early, do it. Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right to flag that. I think there needs to be more of a conversation about that. It's how do we get that? How do we get that conversation to continue? So, I mean, we've ended on slightly less than positive note, but I guess that's the good news for this week. Here at Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, we spend a lot of time exploring what great mathematics teaching looks like. And that's exactly what the story of maths was designed to support. It's a complete curriculum that builds coherence from the earliest concepts to the most complex ideas, weaving representation, reasoning, and proof into every lesson. And because it's written by teachers, for teachers, professional development is not a bolt on. It's part of the fabric of the curriculum itself. Now, schools around the world are already seeing the difference. To find out more, visit alta-education.com/TSOM-overview. So the next segment, it's bigger than that. It's large. The one story not getting the attention it needs this month.
Yeah, so the one that stood out for me again was from Schools Week, and it was I think the headline was almost half of head teachers needed mental health support in the past year. Um, I mean, again, I know headlines and stats are meant to be there to pull you in and to grab you with how sensationalist they seem, but that to me is another deeply worrying statistic. And we know that the pressure on the heads is ever increasing, and that like in the post COVID schooling, how difficult it has been. And perhaps that within our own organisations we don't check in with head teachers enough. I know that's something that when I was a teacher, I didn't. I was guilty of not asking my heads that I worked with if like are they okay? How are they getting on? And that we can, I think, in my instance, perhaps naively seeing them as at the top of the pyramid, and thinking, well, like that's part of the role, and with that role comes its own stressors, but never checking in on them to see how they're actually doing. And that I would often go into head teacher or SLT and then vent about whatever issue they've been that day. But if they're at the top, who do they have to vent to? And many heads, it can be a very isolated or isolating role, and not every head teacher has a network of trust schools or other head teachers that they work in partnership with. So that to me is something. I mean, for almost half of all head teachers, well, in however they collected the data to be seeking out mental health support, that is deeply troubling.
Yeah, and regardless of the accuracy of the actual numbers themselves, even having one head teacher struggling, I think is enough to flag it. I think it has never been tougher to be a head teacher. It certainly seems like things are just getting tougher and tougher, and the role is evolving into something almost unrecognizable at times. And especially with the crossover with DSL responsibilities and in some schools. So I think really really important. I went to mind.org.uk, and it has a massive list of all the different helplines you can call. So like the Samaritans, Seeing Line, Campaign Against Living Miserably, Shout is one that if you prefer not to talk but you want some mental health support, which sound really interesting. You got Switchboard, and they've even got some bonus sort of information about sort of different situations. Before you call the helpline, or if you can't talk on the phone. So if anyone's listening and they're actually thinking, you know, that their mental health is perhaps something that they need to address or they need some help, I think give those numbers. I'll make sure they're linked. That's mind.org.uk, and there are a range of different people to call depending on your sort of your situation.
Yeah, so I've just found the article and I've opened it up, and it was an annual poll from the NAHT, which I think is like the National Association of Head Teachers, if I'm not wrong. They surveyed 1,517 school leaders, in which they found 45% of heads reported needed mental health and wellbeing support in the past year. 72% of respondents said their job has had a negative impact on their mental health. So even there, it's even higher. So 45 have sought out support in the past year, but 72% have said it's had a negative impact, which is up from 65% the previous year. 92% of heads said the role has affected their sleep, with 83% reporting increased worry and stress. And all of these are up. All these stats are up from the previous year. And it also says that, interestingly, 87% of heads said the time they spent supporting their staff with mental health issues has increased in the last 3 years, as teacher wellbeing rates have dropped to the lowest since 2019. So, yeah, it's evident that there is a crisis at play here. So please do, if you're struggling or you need support, please do reach out to those organisations that Kieran just referenced.
I think the upside is that people are actually acknowledging it, and fair play to those 45% who actually got in touch with someone to ask for help, because it was not long ago that there was no conversation around this, and reaching for help was not a thing you did, and you perhaps go to alcohol, or other sort of, but other ways to deal with your mental health, and the fact that we're having these conversations, and the fact that people are willing to seek help, I suppose, is the light at the end of the reasonably dark tunnel. If you've ever finished an episode of Thinking Deeply about primary education and wanted to go further, to read more, think more, and connect ideas, Hey, What You Reading For is exactly where you should start. Each week, we curate the best thinking from across education, books that challenge assumptions, research that informs practice, and podcasts that broaden perspectives. From curriculum and pedagogy to sound leadership and international insights, it's your weekly companion for meaningful professional growth. And because we know teachers are time poor but enthusiasm rich, it's concise, evidence informed, and genuinely useful. Subscribe for free at thinkingdeeply.info. Up next, Don't Call It a Comeback, the best Substacks and blog posts from the last month or so. Do you want to hit me with some of yours, Elliot? Then I'll give you some of the ones that I've been reading this month.
Sure. I'll kick off with a Substack. I'll be honest, I'm still getting used to Substack. Like some people I seem to follow, some people I seem to subscribe. I don't really know how it works, but either way, I'm enjoying the content that's being served up. And I really do recommend, if you're interested in just reading on many different areas of teaching, please do sign up to it because it's free and there's so many people putting out great content. So one I read, I think 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure if it was actually even a new one or just it served up to me recently, but it was by the Educators, which I believe is two people. But I think the person who authored the Substack was called Anna, um, and it was talking about mini whiteboards. Um, and it looked at like the reality of using them versus not using them. So it was going back to that essential point around if we don't have whole class responses, that we're driving blind. And the blog sort of contrasts the reality of what would happen if we're using them versus what would happen if we don't use them. So like using them, we can get like 80% success rate, and we can see that, and then we can go and support the children who aren't quite there yet. Versus if we're not using them, then we might have misconceptions that end up being embedded. And it talked about that mini whiteboards. It's not as simple as just using them, and therefore practice is effective. They need to be backed by effective routine. So being able to gather whole class information really quickly, and then that being able to inform our next steps. Another one that stood out to me, another Substack, was friend of the podcast, Chris Such. He started a Substack and did one on the most common reason why children don't become fluent readers, and sort of steps we can take to address that. And he was talking about how the most common reason isn't about dyslexia or sort of gaps in schooling. It's that simply children do not read enough. And part of the Substack talked about how phonics has obviously had a great impact, but it can sometimes be viewed as like an endpoint rather than the gateway to fluency. And that fluency being dependent on pupils consciously decoding words enough so that they're starting to become instantly recognizable, freeing up that cognitive space needed to actually comprehend what they're reading. And then Chris goes on to outline many ways that we can do this through sort of scaffolded practice. So, echo reading, multiple reads of a text, and so on. And he really hammers home like how important this is, because we know that a lot of children don't read at home at all. And then perhaps some do, but not often a lot. And that in their time in school with us, we need to get that mileage in as much as we possibly can. The last one that stood out to me, I'm not sure if it was on Substack or not. I think it might be on his own website. Is it Brendan Lee? I think his name is. And he talks about, I think the name of the piece of writing was engineering the aha moment. And in this blog, he's pushing back on that false dichotomy that you see online about direct instruction versus discovery learning, which is obviously quite important because sometimes our practice does fall somewhere between the two. Um, and he talks about how discovery learning can succeed, but there needs to be the sort of prerequisites in place to engineer what he refers to as that aha moment where children may discover something for themselves. But actually, it's resting on that foundation of explicit instruction, having set them up with the sort of foundational knowledge and skills that enable them to engage in the sort of discovery learning tasks and discover things themselves, those aha moments. So I can't really remember the definition or of this concept he talked about in the blog, but he talked about contingency adduction, which is essentially where discovery learning can work, and that it can lead to sort of these curriculum leaps. So when pupils have the fluency in those basics, it allows them to engage in the sort of more complex things without necessarily having instruction beforehand.
So I really enjoyed Brendan's podcast about it because he was that the when to utilize discovery is it can be quite the skill. It takes a lot of practice. So I thought his explanation was excellent. I didn't realize Chris had started writing again, but it's good to see. And then I know that Shannon talked about the educators before, so that comes with her seal of approval, I imagine. So the two from me, Matt Hinckley has got the excellently titled Control Alt Teach, which is his sort of computing and artificial intelligence Substack, and he's got one post on there, well, two posts on there. One's a welcome and an explanation about what he's planning to do, and then the other is his analysis of a different tool. I think his plan is to analyze different tools and things and sort of look at how they work in practice, and so I think that's really helpful for teachers. So definitely check that out. And then Ben Cooper, a learning model with the environment in mind, and essentially he builds on the simple model of memory to develop our consideration of the learning environment, and uses this phrase, the external memory field, but essentially, it's about where our attention's being spent and the controls that we can have around us, and well worth checking out. So it seems like Substack is becoming the shorthand for blog, but remember that TDaPE, thinkingdeeply.info is on Beehive, so is Peps, and so is AI for Schools, so the cool kids are all hanging out on Beehive, even if everyone else seems to be going to Substack, so we shall see. But it has been a really, really good month. And like I said, looking for things has been really fun, and keeping a note of them, because I think I've definitely read more since in between our two episodes, this episode and the last, than I have for a while about education. So it's good to be back in the flow.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, it would be like we'd read these and we'd retweet them and share them, but like now, where there's not as much engagement in those platforms, you feel like it's sort of less productive to do that. I mean, we still share these things in with like colleagues and in WhatsApp chats and so on, but it's great to have a space where we can think, oh, this is a really good article or blog. I really want to share this with the TDaPE listeners.
Yeah, and I think if anyone's listening thinking, oh, how do I share it? How do I get involved and how do I support people? Well, obviously, you can send them to us, but commenting in the platform usually will give it a signal boost. So if anyone's listening to any of the episodes of TDaPE, if you're listening on Spotify, you're listening on Apple, you're listening on YouTube, stick a comment in. Sometimes people have questions, but even just stick it in, and then more people will hear it because they're thinking, oh, that must be something worth commenting on. And I think it'll be the same on these platforms. If you write a comment saying, oh, I really enjoyed this, or I thought this, have you considered this other thing? I think that can help to boost people in the way that a retweet or a post on Twitter would have helped. Yeah, it does feel good, and I think of the links that I've got in the show, that's almost like the newsletter. This one was the one with the most link clicks last in January, so people were definitely responding really well to sharing those blogs. One final pause, because AI for schools is becoming one of those topics where everyone has an opinion and almost nobody has a plan. So AI for schools is a practical way through the noise. You all know Neil Almond, you know James, you trust them. It's not AI will fix education propaganda, and it's not fear mongering either. It's more like, here's what it is, here's what it isn't, here's how to use it safely, and here's how not to embarrass yourself in front of your staff. So if you're already confident, you won't need it, but you'll find it interesting. And if you're not, and you're making decisions that affect safeguarding, workload, and learning, then it's definitely worth your time. The website's forschools.ai. Make your choice now. And then last but not least, we've got the recap. So what's been happening in TDaPE this month? So what stood out to you? Anything so far?
Yeah, the one that has particularly stood out to me was Mark Stewart's one on left-handed writers. There were a couple of things when he spoke about that left-handed child failing the 11 plus by 1 mark, and talking about how that particular test had the tick boxes on the right-hand side, so their hand was covering the question each time they went to answer. That really made me stop. I was on a walk as I was listening to this podcast, and it made me just stop for a moment and think about all those tasks I've designed over the years with different classes, and the like seating plans I've had, like how I've never really acknowledged that how difficult it can be for someone who's left-handed. Because he also mentioned about them bumping elbows if they're sat next to a child who's right-handed. Um, and I guess when I addressed that in school, it was always reactive on my part rather than proactive. And I think teachers need to be made aware of who is left-handed as part of like any transition we do. And he talks about how government doesn't collect data on it, and I imagine schools don't either. But that is something that I think we should be very conscious of as schools, and we should be informing in teachers about it. So yeah, I really recommend going to listen to that episode. And I think Mark also authored part of the writing framework around left-handed support.
I think for me, it was Jake and Will when they were talking about how they recorded themselves for their own professional development. And I think it was really top stuff on reflection, on recording, the actual practicalities of it, but how you can develop your practice. And it was about being really specific and if listeners are interested in almost taking control of their PD and reflecting on their practice, they made it really clear how you could do this really effectively and on your own. So you don't need it like a coach or anything there because you do stuff yourself. So like I really Mark's was really interesting because Mark's obviously not a teacher, but he's a lot to offer in terms of how we can support left-handed pupils or left-handed riders. And so yeah, so I think it's been a really strong month, but I am biased, so I always say I would naturally say that. But we got lots of great things on the horizon in 2026. I think we're off to a really good start, and we've managed to keep the Saturday Wednesday in the main going, and we've got another AI for schools episode in the tank. So in England, it's half term next week. Hopefully, you agree on that, Elliot, because I know Kent was ahead in October, but the Wednesday after that will be their first Wednesday outing as because I think they were Saturday last time, or maybe they were Saturday and Wednesday. Either way, we've got an episode in the tank. We've got us during half term, which is what people are listening to right now. So we're keeping the ship on its merry voyage through the world of education. I've really enjoyed this. There are places I'm definitely going to go after this episode, and also things I'm going to be keeping an eye on in the world of education. So all that's left to do, Ellie, is say thank you very much for joining me,
Thank you for having me. See you next time.
and to everyone at home. Until next time, thanks for listening.